Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to the EduSite Network. Our topic of discussion today shall be the crisis in Ukraine, and for this discussion we have thus in our studio our subject expert Dr. Rajan Kumar, Assistant Professor, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. With this I welcome him and also request him to begin our today's lecture. Thank you for coming,
sir.
Thank
you, Roshi, and after a gap of a few weeks I'm back again. And today I'll be talking about this crisis in Ukraine, and as you might have been watching the television that every day there is some crisis happening in Ukraine, and this crisis started in 2013 and you have been following this in the TV, newspapers and other places. So today I'm going to explain you what are the factors responsible for this crisis in Ukraine, and what are the negotiations that have taken place in the recent, in the last 1 year or so. I'll start with the basic history, the background of the crisis. I'll also go into that kind of symbiotic or very intensive engagement that was there between Russia and Ukraine in the last, in the post-Soviet period. Then I'll go about what are the factors responsible for this crisis, and then finally I'll talk about the way out. So what are the ways that this crisis can be resolved? So let me give you a background. If you have been following the news, this problem started in 2013 when the president Yanukovych in November 2013 he refused to sign a deal with the European Union, and the deal was about the signing of the Eastern European the Eastern Partnership Program of European Union, according to which there were certain negotiations which were supposed to, trade deals and other negotiations which were supposed to take place between European Union and Ukraine. But in November, what Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine of that time, what he did is that he refused to sign the agreement with the European Union. Instead, he signed a deal with Russia, and he also accepted the offer of Russia of $15 billion. Apart from the other deals, like the price of oil which was coming from Russia to Ukraine, and there were certain other offers which were given by Russia to Ukraine for not signing the agreement with the European Union. So that was the immediate cause of this crisis that started in November 2013. But here we'll take a broader holistic perspective of this crisis, and we'll see that how there are certain other factors, the factors which have been accumulating over the years. There's some and the long-term crisis which actually created the crisis in Ukraine. So what are the major issues in Ukraine at the moment, or the issues which led to the crisis? The major issue is that whether Ukraine should join the European Union, the Eastern Partnership Program, which is one of the first steps before Ukraine becomes so-called member of European Union, although member is almost a distant possibility as it appears now. But the whole idea was that first Ukraine will sign a trade deal with the European Union. That will be followed by Eastern Partnership Program of European Union that would be signed between Ukraine and European Union. And then gradually Ukraine will come closer to European Union. So that was the whole idea. But Russia, as you know, that Russia is a country which is very powerful country in that region, and Russia and Ukraine are the bordering states on the one hand, and on the other side, on the western side, you have the countries of European Union. Both European Union and Russia treat Ukraine as a sphere of influence. They would like to have this influence in Ukraine, and they also have a very good trade relationship with Ukraine. But Ukraine's economy, because Ukraine was a part of Soviet Union before 1991, so Ukraine economy is by and large dependent on Russian economy. So Russia, and they have a huge trade between trade and the pipeline, the Russian pipeline which goes to Europe. That pipeline, the 60% of the pipelines, or 60% of supplies, the oil supply or the gas supply, that goes through Ukraine. And I'll show you the slide, and I'll also show you the map of the pipeline that is passing through Ukraine. But important thing to understand is that the crisis in Ukraine is not an internal crisis. The crisis in Ukraine is a crisis created by two very powerful countries in the neighbors. Two powerful blocs rather. One is the European Union on the western side, and Russia in the eastern side. So that is one. Second, We can also understand the crisis through this historical, the way history unfolded in the post-Soviet period. And another issue which is at stake is that the NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO is also trying to incorporate the Eastern European countries in its membership, and Ukraine is one of the important country in that region. As you know, that Ukraine has the largest geographical territory in Europe. So the second issue is whether Ukraine can join NATO or not. And if you talk about the internal elites of Ukraine, they are divided over the issue of whether to join European Union or whether to join the Eurasian Union of Russia. The problem with the Ukraine is that Ukraine is not a homogeneous society. In Ukraine, you have 17% of the population which are Russian, the Russian minority, and they're the Russian-speaking people. So it's not a homogeneous state, and especially on the eastern side of Ukraine, the 17% of the Russian people, or in some of the provinces like Donetsk, Luhansk, and Kharkiv, these are the regions where the Russians are still dominant, and they are in the eastern side of Ukraine. And these were the regions which were developed, which had the industries during the Soviet period, and some of the industries are still there in the eastern side of Ukraine. So as a result, these regions are pretty well off compared to the western part of Ukraine, and here the Russian majority population is there. So they would not necessarily support Ukraine's attempt to go with the European Union. So as a result, you have a kind of a civil war or crisis kind of situation at the moment in Ukraine, and with Yanukovych's refusal to sign the European Union agreement with the European Union, that sparked a protest leading to violence, leading to Euromaidan protest, where thousands of people started protesting in the Maidan. Maidan is like the broader central square, which is known as Euromaidan. So there the protest took place, and after since 2013 till now, nearly 6,000 people have died in the conflict or the civil war that has started in Ukraine. So that is the general basic outline of the crisis in Ukraine. Now I'll move on to the history of Ukraine. Please understand that Ukraine is very crucial for Russia. In the first Slavic state emerged not in Russia, but it was in Ukraine, and I'm talking of 10th and 11th century, and that was the state which emerged in 10th and 11th century. That is known as Kievan state. Kiev, as you know, is the capital of Ukraine. So Kievan state was the first. Kievan Rus was the Kievan Rus Rus. That is the term. That is the name of the state which emerged in the 10th and 11th century. In fact, the term Rus, as you call it in Hindi, or the Rus as even the Russian would like to call it. So the term Rus emerged from the Kievan Rus, the first state that you see that is emerging in 10th and 11th century. After that, later on, it became the part of the Duchy of Lithuania. Lithuania state was very powerful in the early medieval period, and in that period, Ukraine became a part of that state. Later on, it also became the part of Commonwealth of Lithuania and Poland, and after that, in 17th century, a new state again is emerging in Ukraine, and that remained independent for nearly 100 years, and that state was known as Kozak Hetmanate. Kozak, C Hetmanate, as you can see in the slide. So the new state Kozak Hetmanate emerged in the 17th century, and that state remained survived for nearly 100 years. But what is happening in the late 18th century, that the Russian Empire is becoming very powerful. The Tsarist Empire is becoming very powerful, and in the 18th century, the Tsar of Russia he captured most of the part of Ukraine. So Ukraine from that period became the part of the broader Russian or the Tsarist Empire, and that continued. The Tsarist period continued till 1917, till the Bolshevik Revolution, as you see. But in the process, the Kievan state, and later in the 17th century, and later also, the Ukraine developed an identity which was slightly different from the Russian identity. The language was different, as you know, that the Russian language is slightly different from the Ukrainian language. but Ukrainian language, identity, culture, that started gaining importance right from the 12th century onwards, and it continued till even in the 17th and 18th century when it became the part of the Russian Empire. And in between it also became the part of the Ottoman Empire, which was ruling from Turkey. And as you see that, if you see the map, then you'll find that on the one side, on the one side you had the powerful Russian Empire of Ukraine, and since Ukraine is located on the Baltic Sea, Baltic Sea is on the southern side of Ukraine. So I'm sorry, it's not the Baltic Sea. I'm talking the Black Sea. So the Black Sea is dividing Ukraine with Turkey, and Turkey for a long time, right since the 16th century, it was ruled by the Ottoman Empire. So Ottoman Empire was a very powerful empire, and for some period of time, Ukraine also became the part of the Ottoman Empire. But finally, as I told you that the Tsarist Empire of Russia, that occupied most of the parts of Ukraine, and that occupation it remained the part of Russian Empire till 1917, when the Bolshevik Revolution happened. Bolshevik Revolution happened in Russia, as you know, in 1917. So after Bolshevik Revolution, there was a small period when Ukraine became independent again. From 1917 till 1920, Ukraine became independent because the Bolshevik rulers, they followed a policy of self-determination, and they wanted every state to exercise the right of self-determination. As a result, Ukraine became independent for 3 crucial years, 1917 to 1920. But again, in 1921, Ukraine became part of the Soviet Union, and from that period till 1991, and 1991 is the period when Soviet disintegration took place. So for that period, for that entire period, Ukraine remained the part of the Soviet Union. In 1991, it became independent, as you know, with the disintegration of the Soviet Union. All the 15 republics of the Soviet Union, they became independent, and Ukraine was one of the states which also decided to gain independence from the Soviet Union, as Russia also decided, and several other republics of Soviet Union, they decided. So Ukraine also became independent in 1991, and that is the time when the Western alliances, for instance, whether NATO or the European Union, which came later, so they wanted to gradually incorporate Ukraine into their own sphere of influence, whether in terms of military or economic or political integration with the European Union. So they have been trying since then to make Eastern European countries as part of the European Union. So that is about the history of Ukraine, and in the post-Soviet period, the major development that took place in Ukraine was in 2004. 2004, when the Orange Revolution took place, and Orange Revolution is also part of so-called, as you might have heard, quote unquote, this color revolution, and all the color revolutions were supported by the Western powers, and primarily America, where they would like to promote the Western kind of democracy or the Western kind of human rights value system. And Orange Revolution of 2004 was a reflection of that, and that was the time when the pro-Western leader Viktor Yushchenko, he came to power, but very soon he was replaced by Viktor Yanukovych, who became Prime Minister in 2006, and later on this Viktor Yanukovych was the president in 2010. And when the crisis started in Ukraine in 2013, so Viktor Yanukovych, he was the president. He was the ruling president during that time, who fled to Russia after the crisis started in Ukraine. Now, it's very important to understand the major causes of Ukraine. If somebody asks you what are the major causes of the crisis in Ukraine, so I think you have to remember three important things. Eastern European Partnership, the European Partnership Program, or the European Union's Eastern Partnership Program is, of course, the number one. But please understand, the most important cause of this crisis in Ukraine is not just the European Union's Eastern Partnership Program. It's also the NATO's Eastward expansion. NATO, as I'll show you in detail, that NATO has been trying to include all the Eastern European countries, and it included a number of states which were earlier the part of the Eastern European and the Soviet Union alliance system. Later on, NATO started expanding towards the east. So that is one of the major causes of this crisis that you see in Ukraine. The second, as I told you, the European Union's Eastern Partnership Program. So that is the second cause. And third, and which is equally important, is the American or the Western attempt to promote or to change the regime in the name of the promotion of democracy and human rights. That is happening in the Eastern European countries and many of the states also in the world. So these three causes, this NATO expansion, Eastern Partnership Program of European Union, and America's promotion of democracy. These three are the major causes which can explain the crisis which happened in Ukraine. And America has been trying to promote democracy in Ukraine for quite some time, right since Ukraine became independent in 1991. And it has been shown, or it has been shown by the researchers and many of the diplomats, that US has spent nearly $5 billion through civil society organizations in Ukraine to promote what America would like to call the promotion of democracy and human rights. So through organizations like National Endowment of Democracy, America has been promoting, has encouraged civil society to function in these states. But whenever America tries to promote democracy in these states, in most of the states where actually it tried to promote democracy through regime change or through coups, most of them have failed. Whether in Georgia or in Ukraine or in Kyrgyzstan, in the Central Eastern state. So in all these states where there was an attempt to impose democracy from the outside, so all the attempts have failed miserably. And what is happening in these states, they are facing a major crisis. Whether you see the case of Georgia, which faced the crisis in 2008, where again Russia intervened, and also in the case of this Ukraine, where Orange Revolution took place in 2004, but later on the anti-American leadership came to power. The kind of expectations these states had from the Western countries, those expectations were not fulfilled by these states. As a result, what happened, that the alternative group or the alternative elite leadership, they became important, or they came to power in these states. So these are the broader causes through which you can understand, through which you can explain the crisis in Ukraine, which has led to the death of nearly 6,000 people, which has divided the entire Europe into two parts. One again, what you see is many of the people have said that what is happening in Europe now is a kind of new Cold War between Russia on the one hand and European states and America on the other hand. So the crisis which were there, or the tensions or the rift which was there during the Soviet period, or the Cold War period, so those rifts are emerging again in Europe in the 21st century. Now I'll briefly explain you the way NATO expanded in the Eastern European side, or the way they started including some other members in its ambit. The first NATO expansion took place in 1999, and that was the time when Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland, these three states became the member of European Union. Many of the people argued that NATO should cease to exist, because since the Soviet Union, the reason why NATO came into existence, since the region was not there in the post-Cold War period, so many of the people or the scholars and the academics, they argued that NATO should not exist, because NATO should be disbanded, because the alliance system which was there, the Soviet alliance system which was there in the Cold War period, so since Soviet Union ceased to exist, so there is no reason why NATO should exist. But not only NATO continued, but also it started expanding towards Russia. It came very close to Russia, and that is something which is not acceptable by the Russian people or the Russian leadership. And because NATO is still treated, NATO is a major threat for Russian security. And gradually, what happened in the post-Soviet period is that gradually these countries, the European countries, the Eastern European countries, they were included into the NATO alliance system. So in 1999, Czech, Hungary and Poland, that was the first phase of expansion when these three states became the member of NATO. The second major expansion took place in 2004 when the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, these are the three Baltic states. So these three states became the member of NATO in 2004, and the other states like Slovakia, Slovenia, Romania, Bulgaria, so these were the other states. So these 7 states became member of NATO in 2004. So that was the Big Bang expansion of NATO when these Eastern European countries were included into the NATO membership. And since many of these states, Baltic states were bordering Russia, so that created a security dilemma in the mind of the Russian leadership, and they could not understand the logic that on the one hand the Western countries like Obama was trying to break a deal with Russia in the name of resetting the button or through a Russia-NATO partnership program, but on the other hand they were also trying to come closer to Russia, and not only that, they were also trying to have a ballistic what is known as ballistic defense missile program, where it will provide a shield for the European countries in case there is an attack from the hostile country. Later on, they also they shifted. First, they wanted to have the shield or the anti-ballistic missile system installed, or they wanted to install this in Czech Republic or Poland, but later on they decided to have it in the waters, in the sea. So that created a major security threat for Russia. And in 2009, the third expansion took place where Croatia and Albania, these two became the members of NATO. But even then the European countries or the Western states were not satisfied. So they wanted to include some other members also, and they wanted to include countries like other countries of Eastern Europe and Caucasus. They were eyeing on states like the Eastern European states like Moldova, Belarus, and Ukraine on the one hand, on the Eastern European side, and in the Caucasus they wanted to include Georgia, Armenia and Azerbaijan. So they started focusing, the European Union and NATO, they started focusing on these states. As you see that in 2008 there was a crisis in Georgia where Georgia signed a deal with the similar kind of deal with the European Union, and there was some crisis in the two of the Georgian provinces of Abkhazia and Ossetia. So in Abkhazia and Ossetia, which were bordering the Russian side, which are bordering Russia. So in these two provinces, the Russia had to send its army, and finally the crisis was resolved. But these two republics of Georgia, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, they practically became the de facto states, and the Russian presence is there, and they are practically, and Russia has also recognized the independence of these republics, although most of the Western states have not recognized the independence of these states. But South Ossetia and Abkhazia, that became that became de facto independent from Georgia. But even then, the European Union or the leadership of the European Union was not willing to learn the lesson, and they wanted to include Ukraine into a system. And what provided a kind of alibi for them was that there was a crisis in 2008 when the Russian stopped the supply of gas to Ukraine because Ukraine was not in position to pay the debt that it had taken, and also there was a charge that Ukraine was taking away the gas which was supposed to go to the European states, because the pipeline from Russia to Europe is pipeline. Two of the pipelines pass through Ukraine. So it was argued by Russia that the gas is being siphoned off by Ukrainian, and that led to a stopping of gas supply. And since this in the month of winter, when there is no gas in a country like Ukraine, so that becomes very difficult because it's the very severe winter in Ukraine is in the month of January, and that's the time when most of the that's the time when the gas conflict between Russia and Ukraine took place. So those were the broad backgrounds against which the European Union was trying to make Ukraine part of its broader economic and political partnership program. But on the other hand, NATO is also trying to make Ukraine, to include Ukraine as one of its members. But the presence of NATO would have meant that the NATO forces would have come to the borders of Russia, and that was definitely not acceptable to Russia. And that's the reason you see that Russia reacted very sharply when it became clear that European Union is going to sign a deal with Ukraine, or when Yanukovych refused to sign the deal. European Union, along with America, they supported the coup which took place in Ukraine, and which finally resulted in the change of regime there. Yanukovych fled to Russia, and the new leadership emerged there. Finally, the leader Petro Poroshenko, he became the president. He is the pro-Western leader, and he was supporting Ukraine's closer alliance and closer political and economic integration with the European Union. So I'll show you the map here, and if you can see the map, then there are three phases when if you can see the map here, so there this 1949 is the period when NATO came into existence. 1952, again some members were included. You can see the colors which tell you that which are the countries which are included gradually into NATO system. And the green one that you see, the green ones are the ones which were incorporated in 1999 and 2004. And later on, as I told you, in 2009, the Albania and Croatia, these were the two states which became the part of NATO. So gradually it showed this map shows you how NATO was expanding towards the east, and you can also see that how the NATO expansion, NATO has come to the borders of Russia, and that created a security threat for the Russian strategic thinkers and the leadership, and that was unacceptable to Russia, and that created a crisis in Ukraine. Finally, it's important to have a broader overview of Eastern Partnership Program that I told you. It's a policy of European Union to forge closer economic and political cooperation with the Eastern European and South Caucasus states. And this program was started in 2009, and this program is a part of broader what is known as European Neighborhood Policy. There is a realization that unless until your neighbors are safe, or unless until you are safe from the neighbors, the security cannot be established. So as a result, since European Union is the European Union is surrounded by many of the troublesome states on the western side, mostly on the eastern side and on the southern side. So they are planning to have a buffer zone. They are planning to have economic and political partnership program with many of the countries in the southern side and also on the eastern side. So on the eastern side, Eastern European side, you have three countries left which are not the part of European Union, the European countries, and these countries are Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova. And on the Caucasus, you have Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. So these 6 states are the target states of European Union at the moment. But also on the southern side, you have other states which are bordering European Union, and I'm talking about the countries like Syria, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and Yemen. So now, since West Asia is facing a huge crisis, because as you know, so that crisis has led to a kind of sense of insecurity in the Russian state, in the European state, and they would like to have a secured neighborhood. So this Eastern European Partnership Program is basically geared to achieve one of those objectives, where you create a buffer zone, and also you include neighbors which are stable, politically stable, and from where there is no security threat. They cannot incorporate Russia because of ideological and because of other reasons, but they are trying to incorporate other states which are not so powerful like Russia. So, what the deal, the Eastern Partnership Program, this deal of European Union, what it offers is it offers a tariff-free market to these countries. So they can export products to European Union. European Union is a huge market. So what they offer is the free access, the tariff-free access to the goods and products from these states to European Union, because European Union is a big attracting market for many of the states, and in return these states like Ukraine or whatever states sign a deal with European Union, so these states are supposed to synchronize the trade policy and the tariff policy with the European Union. So that is the deal which was being encouraged by in the case of Ukraine also, and that was the deal which was also which was also done with the Georgia earlier, although names were different, but that was a similar kind of deal where they would like to have a similar trade policy. In return, the people will get free access to European Union in many of the cases, and they'll also get support in terms of the low custom duty or the low tariff. So these were the deals which were being offered to these states, but what Russia has created in its region, Russia is trying to come up with a different kind of economic union. First, it was known as the customs union, and later on this was converted into this what is known as broader Eurasian Union. So in Eurasian Union, there are members like Russia is a member. Then you have Belarus, which is member. Third, Armenia is member, and fourth is Kazakhstan. So these four states have become the member, and Tajikistan is likely to become member of it. So these are the broader states which have become the part which is known as Eurasian Economic Union. So Eurasian Economic Union is on the one side and the European Union on the other side. So in terms of economic integration, these states are actually caught between the two powerful bloc. One is the Eurasian bloc led by Russia, and one is the European Union led by countries like Germany and France, Italy, and United Kingdom. So these are the broader blocs which are fighting for influence in the Central Asian region, in Caucasus, also in the Eastern European countries. So that created a crisis in Ukraine, and basically Ukraine reflected a crisis of this nature. When Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine, he refused to sign the deal in 2013 November, so that created a political protest, because the groups or the civil societies members which are backed by America and the Western European countries, they were not willing to accept the refusal of Ukraine to sign the deal with European Union. As a result, what they started doing that there is a clear evidence now to show that these countries, the Western European countries and also America, they promoted protest in the Euromaidan Square which is the central part of central square in the Kyiv. So there was a protest which took place, and the protest continued for a long period in the month of December, January, February. In the month of February. So these 3 months there was a huge protest, and there was a crackdown. The Yanukovych government also passed a law which made the protest illegal. So after that there was a violence, and there was a crackdown. In the crackdown, first a few people, the protesters, were killed, and after that there was a bigger protest, and in the bigger protest it is said that some of the violence was promoted, although it's very difficult to establish that whether the violence was initiated by the Yanukovych side or the European Union side, because both are blaming each other. They blame that the Western European countries, they encouraged violence in that protest in the garb of political protest, or in the garb of human rights. But there are arguments which say that protest was actually this abrupt. It was sudden, and it was not encouraged by anybody, by any of the groups. But there are debates, and it's very difficult to establish in this kind of situation. But finally, protest continued for 3 months, and in the month of February 2014, it created a crisis kind of situation. So in that crisis, the countries started negotiating, and the countries which were negotiating, they actually almost came to a deal. The Western European countries, France, Germany, and other countries, along with Russia and United States and Ukraine, so they came to a deal that the protester and the Yanukovych government, they came to a deal where Yanukovych was supposed to continue till the time of the next election. He'll continue in the government but there will be an election in a stipulated time frame. So that was the deal. But the deal just after the deal, there was a next crisis came when Yanukovych feared his death and he fled to Russia. He could not live there so he fled with his family to Russia, and that created a very difficult situation for Ukraine. The regime that came to power in Ukraine after Yanukovych fled to Russia, so that regime was completely pro-Western regime, pro-Western government. So that created a fear in the Russian mindset. Russia thought that NATO now, and unless until it takes a very important step of sending the army or protecting the state of Ukraine, because there was Russian population in the eastern side of Ukraine, and they were in huge majority in some of the republics and some of the cities like Kharkiv, Odessa. Then you had Donetsk and you had Luhansk. These were the eastern cities, and there the Russians were in the majority. So, but the most important for Russia from the strategic point of view was Crimea. Crimea is on the Black Sea, is on the northeastern side of Black Sea, which was part of this Ukraine, but it was leased by Ukraine to Russia for military purposes after the disintegration of the Soviet Union. But Crimea was very important for Russia because Russia had this nuclear naval base in Ukraine, naval base in Crimea. So Russia feared that in case Ukraine becomes a part of European Union, or in case NATO sends its forces in Ukraine, so in that case it will lead the security of Crimea can be threatened. So as a result, what Russia did, that Russia sent its army to Crimea, and Crimea was annexed by the Russian forces. And the claim of Russia was strategic and historical, because Crimea was traditionally part of Russian Empire. Crimea was also part of the Soviet Union, but in 1954, Khrushchev who was the president of Soviet Union. So Khrushchev in 1954 gifted Crimea to Ukraine. So that gift that gift continued even after the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and Crimea remained part of Ukraine after 1991. But once it became clear to Russia that NATO forces are going to come to Crimea, and NATO forces are going to be there in Ukraine, so Crimea was annexed by Russia, and Crimea became part of the Russian Empire. So the term used by Russia was reintegration, and the reason being that it said that since Crimea was traditionally, historically part of the Russian Empire and also part of the Soviet Union, also part of the Russian Republic, so Crimea does not belong to Ukraine. Crimea should become a part of Russia. But many of the Western critics, Western critics and the politicians, they argued that Putin, who is the leader of Russia, Putin is trying to fulfill his imperial ambitions by restoring the Soviet Empire, and that was not something acceptable, and there was very critical. Putin was criticized as a dictatorial, authoritarian, a czar. They also said he's lost his sanity, but the fact remains that Crimea was so important strategically for Russia that Russia could not bear that NATO forces are there in Ukraine, and which can threaten the Crimean the security in Crimea. Now let me show you the brief chronology of crisis. So 2013, Yanukovych rejected a major economic deal with European Partnership Program, as I told you, and rather it accepted a deal of $15 billion, which was offered by Russia. And Russia also offered very cheap gas price to Ukraine. So Yanukovych accepted that offer rather than the European Union's Eastern Partnership Program. So the protest in which 100 persons were killed, and there was a deal signed in 2014 between Yanukovych and the opposition where former decided to stay in power till election, but the deal fell. On February 22, Russia captured Crimea and it declared its integration with Russia. Later on, a very tragic crisis happened in July 2014 when MS-17, the Malaysian aircraft, that was shot down by the rebels. The Western sides, they blamed on Russia, and the Russian side blamed on the Ukrainian that Ukrainian state and its army shot down this aircraft. This was a civilian aircraft passing through that route. So in which a number of people from the Netherlands, they were killed, and the passengers from other countries were also killed, but most of the passengers were from the Netherlands. So that created a huge crisis again in Ukraine. And the blame game continued, and it was never established that which side, whether the rebel or the Russians or the Ukrainians, they shot the MS-17, but many of the people argued that it was shot down by the rebels and not by the Ukrainians. So what is Russia's response to this crisis? Russia, please remember that Russia is a very, very powerful state, and the powerful state would always like to protect its territory by making us one of the neighboring countries as a buffer zone. So Ukraine is a buffer zone, is a buffer state between Russia and European Union. So Russia would like to continue Ukraine. Russia would like to keep Ukraine as a buffer state between European Union and Russia. Crimea was part of this until 1954, but again it was reintegrated. And Great Powers, please remember that Great Powers are very sensitive to the presence of hostile enemies in its borders, and NATO's presence and possibility of NATO coming to Georgia or coming to Ukraine. So that is something which created a security crisis in the region. And the foreign minister of Russia, Lavrov, he accused West of trying to create a zone of influence, and he also said that the Russian pipeline and the Russian security would be threatened if Ukraine becomes part of the European Union and later NATO. Here is the map. If you can see the map here, so you can see in the Ukraine, and you can see the two pipelines which are passing through Ukraine. One is the Soyuz pipeline, and the second one is the Brotherhood pipeline. So Druzhba pipeline. Druzhba is the term in Russia for brotherhood. So these are the two pipelines which are passing through Ukraine. And as you can see, the red pipeline. So the red pipeline that you see, they are the gas pipelines, and they are passing through Ukraine from Russia, and they are going up till Germany, Italy, Hungary, and other states. So that pipeline is passing through Ukraine, and that's the reason Ukraine at times is trying to manipulate Russia, because the gas pipeline is passing through Ukraine. So it would like to obtain gas from Russia at a cheaper price. In fact, Russia used to supply gas to Ukraine at almost half a rate from the international market price. But after this crisis, Russia refused to supply gas at a very cheaper price, and it also asked Ukraine to pay the debt that it has taken over the years by not paying the gas that it has taken from Russia. So these are the pipelines that you see, and Ukraine is also important because of the gas pipeline that passes through Ukraine, Russian pipeline. But after the crisis, Russia has started developing an alternative pipeline which will bypass Ukraine. So it's developing Nord Stream, and it's also developing the South Stream. So these are the two pipelines which are bypassing Ukraine. On the other side, it's also trying to diversify, and it has a pipeline with China, and Russia has signed a deal with China of nearly $400 billion, which is probably the biggest energy deal in the world. So Russia is trying to diversify after the crisis, and I'll come to that later in the discussion. So as I told you, that Russia claims it's a reintegration of Crimea, not the annexation, and the term used by the Western state is the annexation, but the term used by Russia is reintegration of Crimea. So Western countries criticize Russia as an imperial power who sought to restore the territory of the former Soviet Union. Putin as an autocrat who considers the disintegration of Soviet Union as the greatest disaster of the 20th century. The Western response was, first they tried to negotiate with Russia. They also tried to bring on table the different sides, the rebel group, the Ukrainian side and the Russian side, but they were more interested in controlling the regime rather than a real negotiation. Because when Yanukovych was president, a deal was almost likely to be signed, but immediately after that, that coup took place when Yanukovych fled Ukraine and he went to Russia. And very tragically, Yanukovych's son, who was traveling in Siberia, he was killed in an accident. It was nobody knows why that accident happened. It was a very mysterious kind of accident, but he died in that. He was very young. But more than that, what happened when the negotiations failed, the sanctions were imposed by the European countries and by America, and sanctions were on the companies, many of the companies of the gas companies or the oil companies of Russia. Sanction was also imposed on many of the oligarchs, on many of the powerful allies of Putin. Many of the cabinet members, the politicians of Russia, were the part of the United Russia Party, the ruling party. So the sanction was imposed, and so that was the second thing which created again an economic crisis, not only in Russia but also on the countries of Central Asia and other places which were highly dependent on the Russian economy. So sanction was imposed as a Western response. IMF offered a loan of 17.5 billion to Ukraine against some structural reforms which Ukraine was supposed to do. And European Parliament offered 1.8 billion euros as a loan to Ukraine. And there is also a European Union and Ukraine Association Agreement which was to be signed between between Ukraine and European Union. So these were the broader responses of the Western countries after the crisis. But the most important was the sanction. And sanction, what they did was that the European countries and America, they froze the assets, and they also put a travel ban on many of the Russian leadership, Russian leadership, military personnel, and many of the CEOs of various companies. So the Sberbank, which is the largest bank of Russia, so that bank was that bank could not borrow money from the Western countries. And many of the energy companies, for instance, Rosneft or the Gazprom, they were also banned from taking money raising money from the West, or many of the exports on the products that they did to these countries. So there was a ban on certain Russian companies and individuals. What happened as a result of sanction was that the ruble is the currency of Russia, as you know. So ruble crashed, and the misfortune of Russia was that this was also the time when the oil price, the international price of oil in the international market crashed. And since the major source of revenue for Russia is the export of oil and gas to Europe and other countries, so there was a price, the price of oil came down to nearly 48% from the original price. So that created an economic crisis, or that created a very difficult situation for Russia. The sanction on the one hand, and the price and the going down of price of oil and gas in the international market. So that created a very difficult economic situation for Russia. There was a huge inflation in Russia, and also there was a rising unemployment in Russia because of these factors. The total cost of this economics and of the European sanction is estimated to be nearly $100 billion on Russia. So Russian economy was down by nearly 30%. Russia started looking towards the alternative sources of energy supply. So that was the time when Russia signed a deal with China, and it was the largest deal in the history. It was $400 billion energy deal between China and Russia. The next was the sanction coincided with 48% drop in the oil price, and ruble lost nearly half of its value. Russian economy contracted 6% this year. The Russian banks were hit by borrowing restrictions from the West. And Rosneft oil company and Gazprom, they started asking for the aid from the government because these were the profitable enterprises, but because of the reduction in the price of oil and also because of sanctions, they could not remain a profitable enterprise. As a result, they started asking for the help from the government agencies, and nearly $150 billion of money flowed out of Russia in 2014, because the foreign companies which had invested in Russia and which were supposed to, so they decided to go out of Russia. So that was a huge blow to Russian economy, where nearly $150 billion flowed out of Russia in 2014. Now it is interesting to understand what was the Indian response, because we as an Indian citizen, we would like to know how did India react to that. Please remember that India has maintained a policy of not interfering in the other states. And for India, this was an internal crisis, although because they in India in the thought that it was not important for India to take a side first, because it had a very good alliance, good relationship with United States and Western European countries on the one hand, and historically and strategically India has been very close to Russia on the other hand. So India was trying to maintain a balance between these two blocs. And even if you see the history, that India has generally been soft on Russia and the Soviet Union. During the Soviet times, it did not criticize the Soviet intervention in Hungary in 1956. Similarly, it also did not criticize the Soviet intervention in Czechoslovakia in 1968 and in Afghanistan in 1979. So India has always maintained a silence when it came to criticizing, when it came to taking a position on some of the Soviet or Russian misadventures outside. So, but in this particular case, very ironically and very interestingly, the National Security Advisor of that time, and it was the government of UPA, and the National Security Advisor of that time was Shivashankar Menon. And Shivashankar Menon, he passed a statement saying that Russia has a legitimate interest in Crimea and Ukraine because of strategic reasons, because of its naval nuclear base in Crimea, and also because historically Crimea has been part of Russia, and Ukraine has a huge 17% minority who are Russian. So on that basis, National Security Advisor Shivashankar Menon passed a statement that Russia has a legitimate interest in Ukraine. But that legitimate interest statement came before Crimea was actually annexed by Russia. I just wonder what would be what kind of statement would have come after this annexation. But after annexation, India again maintained a kind of distance with the issue, and it neither took the side of Russia or nor took the side of European Union very clearly. But India's position was taken by many of the Western states and also Ukraine as a part of taking the position in favor of Ukraine. Ukraine was very critical of this kind of statement, and Ukraine criticized India's position on this crisis. And Ukrainian ambassador in New Delhi, he wanted India to take a position in favor of Ukraine and critical of the annexation. But India refused to do that. India rather maintained a kind of balance. In fact, the statement was taken as something which was favoring Russia rather than taking a neutral position. So that was the position of India in the case of Ukraine. India being a member of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, the organization that you have. So India being a member of BRICS also did not criticize the Russian annexation of Crimea. In fact, BRICS failed to criticize, did not take any official position on the issue of Ukraine, on the issue of crisis in Ukraine, especially even after the annexation of Crimea by the Russian leadership. So BRICS maintained a silence. India did not take a position, and China also remained silent. China did not take any clear-cut position on Ukraine crisis, and these countries argued that this is an internal issue, and they have to this crisis has to be resolved through a peaceful negotiation rather than any annexation or any misadventure by any of the sides. Finally, the Western countries, the sanctions started having an impact not only on Russia but also on the Western countries, because as you know that the 30% of energy of European Union, 30% of energy in Germany and many other countries, they are dependent on Russian energy supply. 30% of Germany's energy comes just from Russia, and the other countries are also dependent on Russian supply. So the sanction also started impacting European countries, or it started impacting America, because America was having America has a trade with Russia and many other countries. Many of the Central Asian states which are dependent on Russia, they started facing economic crisis because of the sanctions which were there on Russia. So finally, what is happening at the moment is that a new kind of situation is emerging. A deal was signed. Again, a negotiation took place between the important countries of Europe and Russia and Ukraine, where Germany, France, Russia, Ukraine, they came to agreement on the ceasefire, where, because the protest, even the crisis, the civil war kind of situation continued in the eastern provinces of Ukraine, where in Kharkiv, in Donetsk and Luhansk, these were the republics where the Russian minority, the Russians are in majority, they kept fighting against the Ukrainian state. So it was a civil war kind of situation, and the rebels were ostensibly supported by the Russian side. So finally a negotiation took place, a ceasefire was established, but the recent reports tell us that the violations of ceasefire are taking place from both the sides, from the Ukrainian side and also from the rebel side. So the fight is on, the civil war continues, and it has created a very difficult situation for the European countries. So what is the conclusion? The conclusion is that, number one, that this crisis was created by the Western attempt to make Ukraine part of NATO and also make it part of the broader European integration plan. The way out is for both the regions, Russia on the one hand, European Union on the other. The way out is that Ukraine should be left on its own. Ukraine should not be allowed to become part of either Russian group or the European Union group. And also Ukrainian state has to recognize that the Russian minority is 17% minority, so they have to have the rights over the language, because the Ukrainian parliament passed a law where the state language became the Ukrainian language. But if that kind of policy is made by the Ukrainian state, so the Russian minority will feel alienated. So it's important that Russian minorities are the minority rights of the Russian in Ukraine, they are protected. So unless until that is done, Ukraine can never be a peaceful state. But at the moment it appears that Ukraine is almost on the verge of collapse, and Crimea has already become a part of Russia, and it's likely that Donetsk and the other eastern provinces of Ukraine, in those states, civil war might continue unless until some kind of federal structure is devised by the Ukrainian states. So with this, I conclude my lecture here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir, for this very interesting lecture, very contemporary thing, and also sir has shared the recent developments with us, talking about Ukraine and the crisis. So friends, we shall be back more with as part of this series and talking about other international affairs. So with this, we take your leave, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you friends, have a great day.